interested in this because I heard about it in East Timor in May. Stephen and I were there, and I went into a Catholic church on a very hot day just to rest. And the priest was waving a piece of paper around and speaking to the people in Tetum, which I couldn't understand. Afterwards he spoke to us, and I said, what was that paper? And he said, oh, the Pope has got a letter to us, he's going to send us a letter. I was very excited to be telling the people. This was on a remote island off the coast of East Timor. Oh, he said, you should hear about it. And I said, well, I'm interested in climate change. Well, he said, this is for you. So I have now read the Pope's encyclical, and I agree with John that it's not so much what's in it, the fact that it exists, and that people in islands offshore of Timor and poor places are going to know that the Pope has sort of said something. It's like a tweet, isn't it? It's a small message. I'm doing something about climate change, and you should too, all 1 billion of you, and all your friends, and ripple it out across the world. And I'd like to ask the speakers, where can we take it to? How do we act on it? What's the action that you do with this piece of paper in your hand, waving at people? Look, the Pope said something about it. Well, what do we do next? That's a wonderful question.
It's a very good question, and it is interesting that it is being responded to in a situation as remote as Timor, where in fact it is not being responded to in a situation as close as Australia. The Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference have done absolutely nothing about it. They're really not interested. The essential reason for that is because they're so utterly preoccupied with the child abuse crisis that they really, that's their only agenda at the present moment. It's also interesting that while generally speaking, I just saw a survey on this yesterday, generally speaking, Catholics in the United States have responded positively. Very few have read it. And they've responded largely, and I mean John kind of put his finger on this, they've responded largely because they liked the guy, but if they actually knew what he was saying, they might not like the guy quite so much. And look, I think it's going to take quite some time for it to kind of permeate down. It's going to take time. But I think the key thing is it's on the agenda, and we can now use it. I mean, you cannot believe what it is like for a Catholic like me, who has fought for 40 years to try to get this onto the agenda, and to have to sit through John Paul II, God help us, Benedict XVI, God help us, and then suddenly for it to be on the agenda. We now have something we can use, and I think politicians have something they can use. And you don't. I mean, the problem with tonight is, I agree with the only thing John and I, our emphasis on technology is probably different, but I agree with everything else he says. What's that?
That's because I'm so much younger than
you. Yes, he's a young lad, that's it. When you're 75, I forgot to turn my phone off, it was ringing, but I know who was ringing me, it was my wife. So look, I think it's going to take time, because it's one of those documents that needs to kind of seep down, and people they'll take what they want from it, and they'll reject things. But then again, we do that's how we work as human beings.
Yeah, I do. Look, great question, and we obviously should have been addressing that in our primary presentation. The world is going to focus on Paris in November for global action on climate change. There are going to be a lot of Catholic leaders in Paris. There are going to be a lot of Christian leaders in Paris. This is a document you can beat them up with. I fully intend, having read the document now, I fully intend when Parliament sits next, when State Parliament sits next, to start making a fuss out of this document, largely to put pressure on Tony Abbott through the State Parliament, and I'm going to be encouraging people, my colleagues in the Federal Parliament, to do the same thing. But that's probably irrelevant. The real issue is what you do with it, and I think writing to Tony Abbott, I think a good thing to do now is for all of us to write to Tony Abbott and say, well, have you read Laudato Si? And what do you reckon? You know, where are you at? Where are you at on this? Is climate change still crap? Is the Pope more fallible than you thought he was? What's the run here, mate? I think this is the opportunity. As I said, this is a mainstream dude. It's not John Kaye or you know, Lee Rhiannon saying this. This is a dude right out of Establishment Central saying these things. We should be using that. He's given us a gift, and we should be using that by putting pressure on the establishment to do things. I think there's a second issue in all of this. New South Wales, as you know, is in the grip of an existential battle over coal seam gas and coal. The Pope was unequivocal about gas and coal. Absolutely unequivocal. I mean, it's stuff that Caroline's known for 30 years, and I've known since I met Caroline, about how bad it is and the impacts it has and so on. But we now have another voice in that battle, and we should be using that voice. We should be saying, I'm going to be in my media releases saying, you know, according to Greens MP John Kaye and the Pope, the following is true. And I think we should all be doing that. When we write to our politicians and say, for God's sake, get away from coal seam gas. Oh, by the way, it's not just me saying this, it's the Pope saying this. I think we should just integrate him into our dialogue. I think it would be a useful thing to do for a while, to do that, to actually add yards to what we're doing.
Okay. Now, I don't see any hands from the audience. We'll get back to the line on the bar. Anybody in the body of the hall? Yes, go down. Can you, Jan, or whoever's got the... Down to the back.
Yep. Thank you very much for the talk. It struck me in a sense that traditional or mainstream labor economics says we must bolster aggregate demand in order to generate jobs. But I think the strategy shouldn't be doing that, which is also known as boosting consumption spending. I think at this age of war and environmental damage, the best job creations would be towards restoring the environment damaged by greed, restoring human dignity destroyed by war, and creating value for human life, or life in general in the planet. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll close that with another question. The people down the back, who's got the mic? Go to the back of the room. There are 2 or 3 people down there. And then here, yes, and we'll come back to you. Okay, fine.
My question...
Could you just say, just give us your Christian name? I know who you are, but...
Yeah. Mark. My question centres around attitudes towards the environment, which Paul spoke very eloquently on, whereas the common Western tradition for the last 1,000 years or so has been very utilitarian. There always have been some counter views to that, some of those which Paul mentioned, some of those coming from within the church, and some from outside other spiritual traditions and so on, some secular. A good example of the secular one, as opposed to that utilitarian, would be a more spiritual view, or maybe the word spiritual is a bit loaded, but I like that sort of term, that sense of connectedness with the rest of the world, the rest of the universe, is in a very scientific way. That's also been very eloquently put by people like Brian Cox, even from a scientific view. Even if we just look at the geochemical sort of level and so on, biochemical level, there's strong evidence of that. So my question is that in recent years, certainly we're becoming a more secular society, and if you look at the number of people who put no religion on the census forms, I remember reading quite a few years ago about the potential for concern about the environment, about its potential for embodying a kind of alternative sort of interest in spirituality, or that connectedness with life and so on. So I was wondering, sort of, even though you were saying that sort of on the other hand we've got, you know, people sort of like constantly wedded to their phones and so on, not connected with nature, do you see any sort of opposite trends to that? The potential for an environmental spirituality, basically. I'm not sure if that's the best term, but an environmental spirituality coming to replace, you know, more mainstream sort of engagement with churches and so on.
Okay. Now look, because we have to get a lot of questions in time, we'll link this with another question. There's a lady down the front. Someone got the mic? Yes. Put your hand up, stand up, so we can see you. And then we'll do 2 questions.
No, I just had a quick question, probably for Paul, that
I found liberation theology really inspiring. I think it was back in the 70s when I was very young. And then either those priests were killed by witnessing for the poor in the third world, or else they were excommunicated or told they could never write another book again. So I just wonder, I don't think they mentioned the environment at all, but I just wondered if Pope Francis will kind of let them back into the fold now. Are there any still alive? Are they still around? Or
Okay, two very different questions, and over to our speakers.
Well, I will come back to that environmental spirituality thing. Just interestingly, yes, perhaps the most prominent of the Brazilian liberation theologians is Leonardo Boff. He is still alive, very much alive. In fact, I wrote to him and we've exchanged letters on the odd occasion. Boff was one of the people who hardly wrote the encyclical. So Boff understood really from the beginning the link between social justice, as John I think so very well put it, the link between social justice and environmental issues. Yes, he has had a very big influence on Francis. Francis is very much the product of, I always call him Frankie the RG, because he's very much the product of the Latin American world. And while Boff would speak Portuguese and he Spanish, the reality is that they are very well aware of each other. And liberation theology did move to some extent, at any rate, into a more environmental awareness, and that's specifically problematic with the problems built into the destruction of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. On the question of environmental spirituality, well, actually, this is what this book is about. What I'm arguing is that essentially theology has to come to grips with the natural world. Aquinas says absolutely clearly that the first scripture is the world. The first scripture. The first Bible is the world. That's where you read first about, I'm happy not to use the word God, I would personally use it, but in broad company, I'm happy to just simply say people have a sense of something that is beyond themselves. You just to even look at an animal, and look at an animal, you see something that is not us, and therefore, in a way, places us in our real perspective, in a world where we belong as part of nature, not as separate from nature. And I think the strength of the encyclical, again, is that it has homed in on this anthropocentric business as though the world existed solely for us. I consider that nonsense.
I'd like to comment. It's not actually, I don't want to comment on the theological questions other than to ask a question of Paul, if I may, or seek Paul's comment on the following. One view of the history of religion is that we started out with a group of animists whose spirit, I you know where I'm going, whose spirituality was in nature. They worshipped plants and animals, they worshipped, the story of the Aboriginal people is written in the physical environment. The song lines, the physical features are their spirituality. The economic success of Judeo-Christianity was to remove divinity from nature and make it supernatural. We talk about the supernatural, it's above nature, it exists outside of the Abrahamic religion and the leaving of the Mesopotamian settlement of Ur. They left specifically so they could pursue a different kind of religion and with it a different kind of economics, which proved to be massively successful. And that's one of the ways we've ended up, Fred and I like to tell me we live in a Christian nation. It's one of the reasons why Judeo-Christianity has dominated economically. But it's also true that by removing nature, by removing God or supernaturality or the creator or the creation story from nature and making it supernatural and making it something which created nature, you then open nature up to a different kind of exploitation. And is it possible to see what Francis, the guy's called Francis not by mistake, I understand. He's named himself after St. Francis Assisi, the Dr. Dolittle of the saints. He, and I mean that with no disrespect, but is he trying to undo 5,500 years of removal of spirituality from nature and trying to put some of it back in?
I think the answer to that is not consciously. But I do think that there are people squarely within the Catholic tradition and within the Christian tradition more generally. I mean, the most significant Protestant theologian of the second half of the 20th century is Jürgen Moltmann, without any doubt whatsoever. I've interviewed Moltmann on a couple of occasions for the ABC. And Moltmann is an absolutely committed environmentalist, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. Probably the two most significant Catholic thinkers, not so much theologians as thinkers, are Pierre of the 20th century, are Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and the US priest who died just a couple of years ago, Thomas Berry. And both of these are really understand exactly the question that John is asking, and John's, I think, history, potted history, if you like, of religion is accurate. And I do think that one of the great tragedies of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is the isolation of God, is the divorce of the transcendent from the natural world, and that is a real problem. And it is partly in Christianity, partly and it's also true of Judaic theology, partly the result of Platonism and Neoplatonism, because they drive a wedge between the mind, the soul, the spirit on the one hand, and the body and matter on the other. Now, what I think is happening, and this is a really significant shift in thought, it's not just theology, I think it's broader, it's in thought, that there is bringing back together a sense of, if you like, the spiritual and matter. Teilhard de Chardin has this marvellous essay, To Matter, and by matter he means the stuff of the earth. The Jews had a marvellous word. They did not have a division between soul and body until diaspora Judaism, just before the time of Christ, picked up the Neoplatonics, the Platonic, not Neo, because Neo is Plotinus, about 200 AD, but they picked up the Platonic division. Whereas before, the Jews really had no concept of immortality. That's the whole problem of the book of Job. The Jews considered they would not call us persons. They simply said that we are flesh, we are bashar, we are flesh, we are matter, we are stuff. And I think what is happening in thought, certainly within the Catholic tradition, within the Christian tradition, it's not just Catholic, within the broader Christian tradition, and also I think within the Jewish tradition, there's this realization is starting to recur. But Islam has yet to catch that, I think.
No, too many. Now we will go to the line now. So who is first in the line?
Thank you.
Yeah. And just tell us what your question is.
Yeah, Brian Concannon.
Thank you, Brian.
Oh, two quick questions. First directed to both of you gentlemen. Pope Francis recently said he agrees with a Palestinian state. And I'm just wondering your views on that one. Next question to Mr. Kaye. I heard Bob Brown a few years ago saying that the Greens support one world government. I'm just wondering if you could just divulge anything about that to me. Thanks.
I think we can do the Palestinian thing fairly quickly. The Vatican has a long tradition of supporting the Palestinians. It also has a long tradition of reconciliation with the Jews. I mean, they're profoundly aware of the Holocaust, profoundly aware of what happened to the Jewish people, and profoundly aware that that is rooted in Christianity, that the anti-Semitism is rooted in Christianity. So they are relative. I mean, one of the more professional parts of the Vatican is the diplomatic service, and they are relatively good at balancing these things. But they have got a long tradition of support of the Palestinians. I think I might be wrong on this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I saw just, in the last couple of days that there'd been a bit of a back off from supporting the Palestinians openly by the Vatican. But that's not to say that they're because they're trying to balance the two things of sticking with Israel, but at the same time supporting the Palestinians. Very hard thing to do. They're probably the ones who've come closest to it.
Yeah, I think they're both interesting questions. With respect to the first one, I have a more political view of that. I think that the tide has turned on Israel, and thank goodness, and that there is a growing recognition that the behaviour of a state that oppresses one particular group because of their lack of a particular religious adherence has to come to an end. And I think that is now reflected increasingly. The Obama regime, which is probably the Obama presidency of the United States with the largest Jewish population on the earth and a very organised Jewish population, has driven both Democrat and Republican in the past to a slavish agreement with everything Israel has done. You can see that Barack Obama, in his own way, is beginning to try and kick the edges of that. And he can do that because the slavish support for the State of Israel is no longer monolithic amongst the younger Jewish generation. There are changes, and that will be for everybody's benefit, including, I think, the Jews who live in the Middle East in the long run. I think the similar phenomenon has happened in the Vatican. The enormous guilt because of Pius the 12th. Pius XII's behaviour and the Concordat. So how corporations now challenges the states. The free trade agreements that are going through are the next march towards a corporately dominated world. As corporations get bigger, we need states to get more powerful to respond. And Francis himself says that in ENCYCLICAL, that there needs to be countervailing force from states to represent the common good rather than the individual, rather than private wealth. And I think what Bob was expressing there, and I strongly agree with, is we need states to identify a consensus around what is the common good across the planet and to work collectively for the common good. And there needs to be a greater sense of democracy. Luxembourg has the same number of votes in the United Nations as China. That seems to me to be a little bit unfair. So I think, while we're not saying we should have Bob as world president tomorrow, I think what we are saying, what I agree with, is that there needs to be a reconfiguring of the way states operate on a global fashion. The European Union is a good example of states getting together, and they're probably the most successful of all national identities, or all global players, at fending off the power of the political and economic power of multinational corporations.
Do you believe in all countries retaining their sovereignty?
No, I'm sorry, look, we can't have a dialogue because you've got two people before,
Sorry.
behind three who want to ask a question. So, Bruce, and Kieran.
My name is Bruce Thomas. I'm a non-religious humanist, and I think this is a great step forward by the Vatican. I think it gives hope to the world, not before time. And a list of things in the encyclical was quoted, but it doesn't exhaust the number of things that are covered, but climate change is very prominent, and don't let's argue whether Tony Abbott should be shown a copy of it. He knows very well that his stand on climate change is against the spirit of the encyclical, and he's ignoring it. Now, can he be excommunicated?
Well, that's very easy to answer.
All right, answer. Okay.
No.
No, okay.
I mean, to be excommunicated, you have to do a bit more than disagree with the papal encyclical. I mean, I've openly, as a priest, when I was a priest for years, openly disagreed with Humane Vitae. I was never excommunicated, and I still haven't been excommunicated, even though I've tried a bit.
Okay, Kieran, go ahead.
Hi, I've got two brief questions. The environmental activist and writer Naomi Klein and the economist David Harvey argue that the present mode of production and consumption, capitalism, a system that cannot exist without limitless growth and endless frenetic consumption, is intrinsically incompatible with a rational approach to climate change and the survival of the planet. Do you feel that there is an intrinsic connection between, on the one hand, the ruthless exploitation of the natural world, treated simply as an externality, raw material, dead stuff and financial commodity, and on the other hand, the increased exploitation of human beings, as evidenced in the exponential growth worldwide of indentured labour, slavery, and the increased exploitation of labour in the endless strive for profits and capital accumulation? I'm also reminded of the Platonic division between the slaves and the masters are equated with the spirit and the slaves with the body and the flesh. And my second question, do you agree that an ETS cap and trade scheme is a valid mechanism for reducing carbon emissions, or is it merely an attempt to use the very economic system that caused the problem in the first place as somehow part of the solution?
Yes, no, and no. Yes to the former. I think I said that pretty loudly. I don't think. More into it. Sorry. Yes, no, and no. I don't think that, to your first question, I think I said it in my speech, I don't think that market capitalism as it exists at the moment can address either of the two interrelated and indivisible challenges of climate change and inequity in wealth distribution. And almost anything Naomi Klein says I'm going to agree with anyway. In terms of ETS cap and trade, I think the answer has to be more sophisticated, which is why I said no and no to both your propositions. I don't think an ETS will solve the problem. I think the huge error that was made by the Rudd government was that they thought that having laid the golden egg, they could walk away and do other things. And it's not true. You can't solve it just with that. It may be a useful mechanism if it were in the context of other mechanisms. But there are other. I don't believe you can use pure economics to solve a problem. You need regular. And I'm on the record as saying so. I've introduced legislation into Parliament on 3 occasions now, and about to do a 4th, where you need substantial government interference. You need some thou shalt nots. We should go quite well, shouldn't it? Thou shalt not. We need 10 commandments. Thou shalt not burn coal. Thou shalt not burn gas, and so on. To Bruce's question about excommunication. It's an attractive proposition, but it violates my concepts of the separation of church and state. And I firmly believe, and I must say, I don't have a lot nice to say about Christina Keneally, but I thought that she actually did, as a devout and adherent Catholic, she had a really good grasp on the separation of church and state, specifically on issues of stem cell research and same-sex marriage and reproductive rights. She said, I have private beliefs, but as a politician, I will do the following, and I will do so enthusiastically, and that's what I will. And I admired her for that. Not much else, but I admired her for that enormously.
Can I just say, the Pope's on your side with regard to cap and trade. I agree essentially with John. Neo-rationalist economics created this problem. Capitalism created it. I don't think they should be given the honour of solving it. And I think it's far too simple an approach to say that. I also agree that with John, just on, I think the Christina Keneally example is a very interesting one. Christina Keneally and my wife and I are close personal friends. Now, so I know Christina quite well, but she belongs to a very long tradition of Catholics in politics in Australia. Not all of them for sure, but I mean, if you go back to the old Labor politicians, they understood that, you know, what happened in church and what happened in Parliament were two separate things, and that they had a broader responsibility in a pluralist society. I have no right to impose my views on you or anybody else, and I'm certainly not going to cop it if you try to impose your views on me. So I think that what we have to do is to negotiate these things, and I do think it was a good Catholic tradition to do that. Just one other thing I want to say, Bob Santa Maria, everybody forgets this about Bob, but Bob Santa Maria was anti-capitalist to the core, to the absolute core. Now, I deplore the man, deplore him completely and totally, but at the same time, Philip Adams said to me when he interviewed Bob Santa Maria, he said, "Mate, I couldn't believe it." He said, "The bugger hates capitalists." And I said, "You got it first go, Phil."
Now, you sir who've been waiting very patiently. Do you agree? No? Okay. All right. Well, it's we've got 5 more minutes. Okay. Lucky last. But keep it brief so we can finish on time. Thanks.
This is a question for John. You outlined the educational influences on your upbringing, but I always thought you were Jewish, and you didn't say anything about Judaism. And no, I didn't hear you say anything about it. But the reason I'm asking or making that comment is I just wanted to ask you whether you think that Pope's encyclical is kosher.
I thought I had made it clear. I sort of came from a non-Christian background. My family background was non-Christian, and then I made a disparaging remark to Alice. So I thought that was telegraphing. No, I'm from a Jewish background, and there's a complex discussion then as to whether that makes me Jewish or not. And I don't want to go there. I listened to Fred Nile this evening in Parliament in what I think was probably the most embarrassing speech I've ever heard in my entire time in politics, and that's a very, very high bar to get over. Talking about the halal tax, he meant halal, the halal tax, and picking up on everything loose. And I actually stopped him for a minute when I said, well, so what about the kosher tax, Fred? Because as you know, the extreme Protestants have discovered discovered Zionism, and hence the Jews, in a way that 20 years ago they were the seedbeds of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish sentiment. They suddenly discovered the Jews because of Israel and because it's a bulwark against the people who are not white in the Middle East and all those reasons. So I'm asking you this question today because I'm not in any mood to talk about kosher or halal. I'm still really angry with Fred Nile, so I won't answer that question. Can I just take liberty to talk about B.A. Santa Maria? B.A. Santa Maria, and it's relevant to the topic tonight, B.A. Santa Maria was anti-capitalist. That there is no question. But like the Pope, he didn't have what I would call a firmly described view of what he wanted to replace capitalism with. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that Santa Maria was really keen on was breaking down big farms and having lots and lots of small farms. And it was like a kind of religious commitment to family farms. I don't know how that was going to work with his commitment to large families and how succession was going to work, but that's the man's dead and he can't answer that. But he was not a socialist. To be absolutely clear, B.A. Santa Maria was not a socialist. He was anti-capitalist. I suspect that, and it's always ugly to say this, but I suspect he was influenced by certain elements of Italian fascism in a way that, and I'm not calling the man a fascist, and I'm not trying to make that, but he was influenced intellectually by certain aspects of corporate fascism or state corporatism, the fascist version of state corporatism that existed in Italy really before they hooked up with the Nazis. They were still nasty and horrible people, but they were different. But his view of capitalism was a hippie view in some senses. It was like, if only we could get back to the land, if only we could all have our dirt under our fingernails growing stuff, then all those nasty communists would disappear and all those nasty capitalists would disappear and we'd all be Catholics. Well, that experiment has never really been tried, and I have a suspicion it's a good thing it wasn't.